First things first, before we dive straight in, it's a paper 1 exam. It's going to be a 2-hour exam, and it will be about Germany and medicine through time. Okay, and this paper was from June 2012. Okay, so we come to the first page of the exam paper, and medicine through time is the first set of questions that we'll be answering, and you'll be faced with the source questions first. So we've got source A, source B, source C and source D, and then you will find the questions for these sources here just underneath. So we're going to start with question 1A. Let's read the question. Are you surprised that these treatments were used at that time? Use the sources and your knowledge to explain your answer. Now, before we even look at the sources, let's just get ourselves clear about what we're going to be doing. So we're going to be using source A and source B, and then let's have a look at the key parts of the question as well. So we have got the "Are you surprised?" question here. Now, the technique for an "Are you surprised?" question is hopefully aiming towards something that surprises you and something that doesn't surprise you, but we'll come to that in a second. And the other key part of this question is at that time. So we'll have a look at when the sources were written in a second, but we're looking at "Are you surprised?" and in particular at that time. So we'll have a look at the sources now. Okay, so we're back with the sources here. We can see we've got source A and source B, and I've also got a copy of the question here that we can refer to as we're going through them. So remember, we're looking for things that surprise us and do not surprise us. And now we've got the sources here, we can really explore this idea of at that time. So we can look through the details of the source here, and we've got, for source A, it's an Anglo-Saxon remedy from the year 850, and source B is also from the Anglo-Saxon period, and it is also from 850. So at that time is the year 850, and just to put that within the overall chronology of medicine through time, it's after the Romans, after the ancient Romans, and really before the Middle Ages. So we're in that period that's sometimes described as the Dark Ages. So at that time we need to have a little think about what medicine was actually like, and if this is actually going to surprise us. Let's have a little look at source A then. There are a lot of things that are going to be surprising in this source if we just read it. Some of the weird and wonderful treatments of the time. We've got, for elfin sickness, take fennel and lupin and lichen and a holy crucifix, put a handful of each of the herbs, tie them up in a cloth, dip in holy water 3 times. Lay the herbs on hot coals, then write a Christ's cross on every limb, and take a little handful of the consecrated herbs and boil in milk. Drip holy water on them 3 times, and let the patient eat them before his meal. Now, this is going to be surprising because it is a rather strange and wonderful approach to medicine. And you can take your pick, really. Remember, when we're working with sources, it's important to use quotes. So I would highlight here this bit in particular as a useful quote that I could use to say that I am surprised by this source because they're using quite strange treatments. I'm not making any reference to the date yet, I'm just thinking this is rather strange. And again in source B, from which places should blood be drawn? For complaints of the head, blood should be taken from 2 arteries at the back of the head down to the bone, 4 fingers breadth from the ear. For toothache, from 2 arteries on the little finger on the left hand, if teeth on the right side ache. Again, this is rather strange, so I'm going to be probably highlighting the bit that talks about taking blood from 2 arteries in the little finger for toothache, and that surprises me. Again, no reference to the date. It surprises me because it's toothache and they're treating the finger. That's rather strange to me. Okay, once you've established the things that are surprising and not surprising within the source, it's important that we now start to use our own knowledge and refer to the dates within the sources as well. So let's start with reasons why we might be surprised by these rather strange approaches to medicine. So remember, this is a period of history before the Middle Ages, but after the Romans. So although the Romans and the Egyptians and the Greeks before them had spiritual approaches to medicine, they still were attempting to move towards more natural ideas. So it is rather strange that we are still using spiritual approaches that mention things such as holy water and Christ's cross. So that is why this source in particular is surprising to me. Now remember, we need to offer a balanced answer, so we also need to think of reasons why we're not so surprised. And I would probably use source B for this one, because if we look carefully at source B, it's describing bloodletting, which is part of the four humours. So the knowledge you would use here is to say that source B is not surprising because it is describing a treatment that was part of the four humours that had existed from the ancient Greeks and carried on through the ancient Romans, whereby you have four humours in your body, blood being one of them, and they all need to be balanced in order for you to be fit and well. If you're not fit and well, it means you have too much of one, for example blood, and therefore the treatment is to get rid of it. So there we have two examples of using specific contextual knowledge to explain why you are surprised and not surprised by this source. Okay, so we've now had a look at question 1a and had a pretty good go at answering that. So we're now going to move on to question 1b, and once again, before we even look at the source, let's have a little look at the question and see what it's actually asking us to do. So the first thing we need to be aware of is the source that we're going to be using. So we're studying source C, and then we come to the question, the keywords within the question. We've got an explain question here, and the thing it's asking you to explain is how useful this source is going to be to a historian. So we're looking to explain the use of a source. And then the date is also important, the 17th century. 17th century medicine. So for the 17th century, we're obviously talking about the 1600s. Okay, so here we are with source C. We've got the question here again, how this source is useful to a historian studying 17th century medicine. Use a source and your knowledge to explain your answer. So let's have a little look at this picture here. We've got, as we can see from the blurb underneath, a drawing from the time of the plague in the 1600s, 1660s, sorry. So we've got here a picture of a plague doctor. This man is dressed in a long cloak, he's wearing gloves, he's carrying a stick, he's got a protective hood on in the shape of a beak. And this beak here would have been filled with sweet-smelling flowers and herbs. So this here is a plague doctor. So we need to think about how this is going to be useful to a historian studying the 17th century. So what we're looking to do is to be able to make what's called an inference from this picture. So we're going to pick out some parts of it and see if we can work out what it tells us. Okay, so the first thing I think we should focus on, probably the most striking part of this picture, is the head and the beak. So we've got here some protective headgear, he's clearly covered up, and a beak with strong smelling herbs and flowers in it. So we know, that's our knowledge, we know that that's what's going on here from our learning about the plague. What we need to do now is work out what we can infer, what can we learn from the fact they did this. So the thing that we can learn from this is that people in the 1600s, particularly in the 1660s when the plague was happening, believed that the disease, the plague, was passed through the air. And that is why they're trying to protect their head and their breathing, really, by covering up their entire head and also covering up the air with the sweet smelling herbs and flowers. So that's the thing we can learn. That's why it's useful, because it tells us that particular fact. Okay, so we've dealt with possibly the most striking part of this source, which is the beak at the top. We're going to just very quickly run through a couple more reasons why this source is useful and what it tells us. The first one is the source itself, the fact that I've said that this is a plague doctor. And the fact that they had doctors at that time tells you what they thought about disease in the 1600s, and particularly, as I've said, the plague in 1660s. The fact they had doctors meant that they were trying to think about natural reasons for the disease and natural cures. So that's another reason why it's useful, the fact that this is a doctor. The second part of this source that's quite useful is where he's carrying this stick. And along with the idea that it was passed through the air, they also had an idea that they needed to keep people away. So the stick would often be used to push back patients if they were coming too close. So they were becoming aware not only that it might be passed through the air, but also from person to person. So this was an attempt to make sure that people didn't become ill by passing on person to person. So there's another reason why it's quite useful. Okay, so we come to the last source question on medicine through time, question 1C. And as we've done for the first two, we're just going to read it through and pick out the key parts of it. So it's a study source D. That's the first thing we need to do, is make sure we're using the last source, source D. And then let's read the question. Why was this source published at this time? So it is a why question. And what it's asking is, why was it published at that time? So why was it produced? Okay, so all of the words there are pretty important, but we're looking for reasons why it was published at that time. Okay, so here we have the source and the question. Now, when it is a why was this source published, what you're really looking for is what the message behind the source is. What was the purpose for producing it? What was it trying to tell people? So let's have a little look at what we've got going on in this source. Remember, when we're working with cartoons of this nature and drawings of this nature, every last detail is there for a reason, so all of it is trying to tell us a story, and that includes the title down the bottom as well. So we'll leave the date for now, and we'll just think about what the message of this source is. So let's just zoom in a little bit so we can see it more clearly. We've got this figure here, the skeleton, who is representing death, and the death is in charge of pumping the water that this family is drinking. So straight away I'm going to suggest that death is in the water. So the water is dangerous. And actually, if we scroll down, we see it's known as Death's Dispensary. Death's Dispensary. So this figure is definitely death. And the dispensary, if we look down, is a place where medicines were given out. So these people have arrived thinking that they're getting something healthy, but in fact it's Death's dispenser, and he's actually dispensing death. He's giving out death rather than medicines. And it says underneath, open to the poor, gratis, by permission of the parish. This is being given by order of and by permission of the parish, so the local government thinks they're doing something right. They think they're doing it right, but actually what's happening is there is still death in this water. So that's the message behind the source, is that there is death in the water. The purpose of the source is to try and get people to try and change the situation that they find themselves in. So this isn't just telling people that there is a risk to drinking the water, it's also trying to get them to change the situation, to act against it. Okay, so now we've established what the purpose and the message of the source is, we can go back to the question and have a think about why that was the message at that time. Why was it released at that time? So what we need to do is think about the date of the source, so 1866. Now, a good starting point is to think about the 1800s, Industrial Revolution, cities and towns becoming overpopulated, dirt and disease everywhere. Those are good general points, but to get really top marks on this question, you need to be very specific. So you need to know why 1866 is important. So we need to be aware of what's happened by this point. So by 1866, we've had the Chadwick Report, we've had attempts at public health acts, we've had Dr. John Snow's work with his map, noting that cholera was a waterborne disease, and we've also had Louis Pasteur's germ theory as well. So by 1866, we'd had all of these things. So people are aware that disease was passed not by miasmas, not by bad air, but either through germs in the air or through germs in the water. So that's why this source was published at that time, is because discoveries had been made, but there was still a slow rate of change, and people like this family were still having to drink dirty water. There were still cholera outbreaks. So the reason it was published at that time is to draw attention to the fact all of these advances have been made, but there was a very slow rate of progress.